Welcome to the historic Blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe, not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Story 1. How Livestock Tax Built a Canton. In the mid-13th century, the small mountainous region of Uri, a cold and often unremarkable canton, nestled within the alpine heart of what is now central Switzerland, was engaged in a quiet revolution. This was not a revolution marked by swords, but by numbers. More specifically, cows. You would not think that a ledger about cows could change the trajectory of a region. Yet in a society that was deeply rural, fiercely independent, and overwhelmingly dependent on dairy, the cow was everything. It was money. It was status. It was survival. At the center of this sleepy revolution was a parchment-covered volume known locally as Die Rinderliste von Uri, the Cow Ledger of Uri. Compiled painstakingly by scribes in the low stone building that functioned as both town hall and storeroom, the ledger was an ongoing registry of every taxable cow in the canton. And there were rules, so many rules. A land without kings, but with too many laws. By the early 1200s, Uri was still nominally under the protection of the Holy Roman Empire, yet in practice, the canton was self-administered. This meant that its people, especially its land-owning farmers and guild leaders, needed a system to resolve disputes, raise funds, and enforce local order. Without castles, standing armies, or any real noble oversight, Uri turned to the power of collective record-keeping. At the heart of this was a yearly livestock census. Every November, after the harvests were done and before the winter snows, appointed tax counters known as Viehschätzer, literally, cattle estimators, would travel through mountain paths and foggy valleys with parchment, charcoal, and a companion bell ringer to mark their approach. Each household was responsible for presenting their cows physically in front of these counters. Not just any cows, every taxable cow. Cows under 2 years of age were exempt. So were cows owned communally by monasteries. But all others were entered into the ledger with astonishing detail. The shape of their horns, the color of their hide, and even distinguishing marks or behaviors. This was not just about taxation. This was about control. Parchment, ink, and the fear of falsification. Creating the ledger was not an easy task. The canton's scribe, often a monk from the nearby Benedictine outpost of Seedorf, would transcribe the lists onto parchment with gall ink. Due to ink shortages, older parchment was often scraped and reused, a process called palimpsesting, which has led modern historians to uncover previous lists buried beneath more recent ones. The descriptions were so meticulous because fraud was common. Farmers would try to hide younger cows to avoid taxation or borrow cows from relatives to inflate their status. In response, Uri introduced an official seal that would be stamped next to each entry, confirming that the cow had been inspected and logged. It was a wooden seal dipped in wax and pressed beside the cow's entry. The seal design changed yearly to prevent forgeries. But even this wasn't enough. A law was passed in 1258 requiring all listed cow owners to swear an oath in front of 2 witnesses that the count was truthful. This ritual occurred at the local fountain, now long gone, in the village of Altdorf. It is the earliest recorded civic oath in Uri's history. Why so many cows? At this time, the dairy trade in Uri was one of its few sustainable industries. The cheese made in mountain huts, especially Alpkäse, was bartered with merchants from Milan and occasionally even France. Cows were wealth. A single mature milking cow could be worth more than a month's wages for a laborer. Losing a cow was a personal catastrophe. Gaining one was reason for local envy. The records helped Uri stabilize its trade. By knowing how many cows it had, the canton could project how much cheese, milk, and leather could be produced and traded. It also helped secure credit with Italian bankers, who began offering loans to Uri's leading families using future dairy production as collateral. And here is where things begin to get truly bureaucratic. By the 1270s, Uri introduced a subledger to the main ledger, the Viewiczelbuch, or Book of Cow Exchanges. This recorded when cows were sold, bartered, or transferred, sometimes including small drawings of cow brands or ear markings. The creation of this second book meant one thing. The cow, for all its snorting simplicity, had become a form of regulated currency. Bureaucracy meets the people. For the average herder, this meant increased scrutiny. They began receiving wax-stamped tokens, essentially early receipts for every transaction. If you sold a cow without recording it in the ledger, you could be fined 2 days' wages and summoned to appear before the Council of Elders. This council, made up of 12 rotating representatives from Uri's major valleys, reviewed disputes on market days and was notorious for long delays and frequent interruptions for cheese tastings. No, really minutes from the 1282 sessions note that meetings paused frequently so council members could sample alpine cheeses brought as tributes or bribes. The cow crash of 1291. Then something unexpected happened. In the winter of 1291, a winter colder than most disease swept through the herds. A mysterious hoof rot decimated the cows in several key valleys, and the numbers plummeted. The ledger for that year shows red ink marks next to dozens of names, a signal of loss. This sudden reduction in livestock threatened Uri's trade relationships and its ability to pay off outstanding debts. The once thriving dairy industry began to wobble. In response, the canton issued temporary exemptions for the poorest farmers and implemented a controversial cow-sharing program, where surviving herds were redistributed and co-managed by multiple families. The ledger adapted again. Now, instead of one name per cow, there were often 2 or 3. Disputes became common. Families began arguing over milk rights, grazing time, and even nomming rights. One marginal note in the 1293 ledger reads, argued over the cow's name. One party called her Goldhorn, the other Moosley. No consensus reached. And so the cow ledger grew. By the end of the century, the cow ledger was no longer just a tax document. It was a mirror of Uri's society, its hopes, its quarrels, and its quiet, slow march toward civic organization. The act of recording had become sacred. Cow-related ceremonies included referencing ledger entries as proof of ancestry, ownership, and obligation. And yet, with all its detail, with all its seals and stamps and oaths, one question remains. Who exactly decided how much tax each cow was worth, and why did the value change every decade? As the 14th century dawned, the rugged valley of Uri was no longer simply a remote collection of herding communities. Slowly, and with the patient persistence only bureaucracy can command, the cow ledger system, once just a humble tax register, had evolved into something far more powerful. It was becoming the backbone of civil administration. What began as a way to count cows was now a network of relationships between families, villages, officials, and even neighboring cantons. The entries in the ledger told not just of livestock, but of debts, disputes, lineage, honor, and the creeping rise of administrative expectation. This was the beginning of governance, not with swords, but with parchment and stubborn tradition. From ledgers to laws. By the early 1300s, the ledger's reach had extended well beyond the pastures. With the memory of the 1291 cow crash still fresh, the Canton Council enacted a series of new ordinances tying cattle ownership to civic responsibility. Owning more than 6 cows meant you were eligible, or, more accurately, obligated to contribute to public duties. These included fence upkeep on communal paths, participation in snow-clearing rotations on key alpine routes, donations to the bell fund, used for cowbells and church bells alike, mandatory attendance at quarterly council meetings. Failure to comply resulted in a small but consistent fine, 1 silver pfennig, or the equivalent in cheese. Uri, quite literally, was funded by dairy infractions. Even more critically, these laws were retroactively written into the ledger margins, turning what had started as an economic record into a quasi-legal code. The cow ledger became a living document of public obligations, and nobody wanted to be left out. In fact, being omitted from the ledger once a tempting path to tax evasion became a source of social shame. It meant you had nothing of value to offer. No cows, no standing. The rise of the ledger keepers. This growing importance gave birth to a new and peculiar class of officials, the Schreibervetter, or fathers of writing. These were not clergy nor nobles, but trusted local scribes elected for their neat handwriting, strong memory, and reputation for impartiality. These Schreibervetter began organizing Kuchenverenzen, cow conferences, every 5 years, during which the ledger would be reviewed in public. Entire families would gather in Altdorf for these readings, bringing their oldest members as living testimony to correlated claims. In a particularly detailed 1313 account, the scribe of that year recorded, Hans, son of Ulrich, presented his case with both horn and hide. His cow, having been struck by lightning, was re-verified by widow Margaret, who testified to its crooked horn and shy demeanor. These conferences grew into rituals with music, baked breads, and eventually, banners showing family brands. They were as much about celebrating civic identity as they were about counting cows. Over time, the scribes added annotations in the margins, including notes on deaths, land disputes, and grazing conflicts. Some added small, careful illustrations, a pair of cow ears, a single hoof print, or a sketch of a branded horn. The ledger as social contract. By the mid-1300s, every person with a claim to land or cattle in Uri appeared directly or indirectly in the cow ledger. It served as a tax register, a birth and death record, a court ledger, a trade register, a source of legal precedent. Entire sections of the ledger began to be organized by village and then by family name. What we might consider today as genealogical records were then simple fiscal entries. Hans of Bueglin, son of Otto, owns 3 milkers, 1 calf, and a patch of Alpside pasture. Owes half-day duty at St. Mainred's field post. The system had a curious leveling effect. While Uri had wealthier families and poorer herders, the requirement to appear in the ledger and to maintain one's place through public oaths and communal duties forged a shared civic identity. Not everyone agreed with this. The case of the invisible cows. In 1342, a scandal emerged. A well-known cheese merchant, Jacob zum Ride, was accused of hiding cows in a remote pasture above Amsteg to avoid tax. The matter might have gone unnoticed if not for a bitter grazing dispute with a neighboring herder. When brought before the Council of Elders, Jacob defended himself with surprising boldness. He claimed his cows had been born outside of the ledger's jurisdiction. In other words, he argued that because no official had seen them born, they did not yet exist in the eyes of the canton. The case dragged on for 5 months and included several witnesses, including a boy who described hearing mooing sounds from the fog. Ultimately, the council ruled against Jacob, but the case had long-lasting effects. New legislation now required midwives to report cow births, just as they did human ones. That year's ledger added a new column, Geburtsort der Kuh, birthplace of the cow. Cow credit and economic expansion. What's remarkable and easy to overlook is how this bureaucracy led to Uri's surprising economic power. By standardizing the value of cows and recording every transaction, Uri became a reliable credit risk for external lenders. Lombard and Genoese bankers, increasingly interested in Transalpine trade, extended favorable terms to Uri merchants, using the ledger as a measure of stability. Small-scale contracts began appearing as appendices to the ledger. One from 1357 reads, I Benedict of Ettinghausen pledge 3 cows 2 brown, 1 speckled to Pietro of Milan, with repayment due in 1.5 years' time, secured against the spring milk yield. Cows, once a local resource, had become internationally recognizable units of value as long as they were written down. Bureaucracy becomes identity. By now, even children in Uri were being trained in basic ledger literacy. Scribes and elders began teaching young villagers to recognize official seals, horn markings, and tax formulas. A folk rhyme preserved from the 1360s illustrates this beautifully. 1 cow for bread, 2 cows for stone, 3 cows to claim, a pasture of your own. The rhyme, likely used to help young shepherds remember civic obligations, reflects how deeply intertwined cow accounting had become with property rights and adult status. In essence, to be Swiss in Uri's earliest vision of itself was to be counted, taxed, recorded, and remembered through your livestock. And then a fire. In 1375, tragedy struck. A fire broke out in the village of Wassen and quickly spread to Altdorf. Among the buildings damaged was the Schrabe House, the scribe's home and storage for the most recent volumes of the cow ledger. Panic ensued. Entire generations of records, debts, claims, family links were believed lost. But fortune intervened. Due to a recent custom of creating seasonal backups, a second copy of the ledger, albeit slightly out of date, had been sent to the monastery in Seedorf for transcription practice. The monks, annoyed at the work, had duplicated nearly 70% of the entries by hand, line by line. The fire shifted policy permanently. From then on, Uri instituted a dual ledger system, storing one in Altdorf and one in Seedorf, and rotating them yearly. It was, in effect, an early example of data redundancy. Still, it raises a deeper question. If a cow was never recorded, or its record was lost, did it ever really exist in the eyes of the state? As the 14th century ripened into the 15th, the once isolated canton of Uri began to take its first halting steps into a broader political world. Surrounded by neighboring cantons like Schwyz and Unterwalden, each facing their own variants of alpine hardship, Uri's cow-led bureaucracy became a template, a model of meticulous governance built not on charisma, conquest, or noble bloodlines, but on the patient accumulation of numbers, names, and oaths. The cow ledger, once a parochial tax tool, now held significance far beyond its original purpose. It had helped establish a civic identity, enabled trade with Italy, inspired legal reforms, and earned Uri a cautious but notable place in early Swiss Confederate politics. But what became of this grand, sleep-inducing artifact of history, and how did it help shape the Switzerland we now know? The cow in the Confederation. In 1291, Uri along with Schwyz and Unterwalden signed what is now called the Federal Charter of 1291, a loose alliance to preserve peace, maintain local autonomy, and resist external domination, especially from the encroaching Habsburgs. While often romanticized as a dramatic moment of liberty and rebellion, the reality was much more mundane. The main clause of the alliance reads, in careful Latin, that the signatories shall aid one another in keeping the peace and administering justice. To enforce this required paperwork, registers, witnesses, ledgers. And so, when Uri entered into this early confederation, it did so with one significant advantage: a fully functioning bureaucratic framework. Its ledger was accepted as legal proof in intercantonal trade disputes. When a merchant from Zug contested a cheese shipment's value, Uri produced a notarized cow count and horn description proving the exact milk yield behind the exported wheels. In a strange twist of fate, bureaucracy became diplomacy. By the late 1300s, Uri's ledger format had been partially adopted by neighboring cantons, who either borrowed scribes from Uri or trained their own based on the Uri method. Cow tax and its careful registration was fast becoming a regional standard, especially as cheese exports grew more important. The bureaucratic map of cow space. As Uri's administrative reach grew, so too did its obsession with boundaries. Cow ownership, after all, required grazing rights, and grazing rights required territorial certainty. A new section was added to the ledger, whiting spruce, or pasture claims. Each claim was tied to named cows and, interestingly, included altitude estimates, stream locations, and rock formations as boundary markers. This turned the ledger into a proto-cartographic document, not a map in the modern sense, but a layered understanding of land use, superimposed with ownership, responsibility, and seasonal shifts. These pasture records were sometimes accompanied by sketches simple but effective showing recognizable trees, hill lines, or even the silhouette of a distant peak. To read one entry from 1402. 2 cows graze west of Bitter Stone, between the twisted pine and the fall of snowmelt, returning before the shadow leaves the second ridge. This poetic precision served a legal function. These natural markers were harder to alter than fences or flags, but it also anchored Uri's sense of place in shared observation, a kind of environmental bureaucracy. Cow names, identity, and memory. By the early 1400s, cow naming had become a regulated cultural practice. Previously whimsical names like Goldhorn or Muesli gave way to standardized naming templates designed to track lineage and ownership. Cows were now named using a system combining color or marking, e.g. brawn fleck, owner's family prefix, e.g. Hans Lenny, year of birth abbreviated. So a cow might be officially listed as Hans Fleck 03, meaning a speckled cow born in 1403 belonging to the family of Hans. This reduced confusion in court cases and improved tax clarity, but it also led to the emergence of cow genealogies, with ledgers tracing the descent of certain productive cows over generations. These entries sometimes included affectionate marginalia, such as mother of fine butter yield, calm temperament, once wandered to Seelisberg alone. Even today, remnants of these naming systems exist in alpine dairy traditions. But what they really represented was the bureaucratization of memory, a formal way to prevent forgetting. Bureaucracy as justice. The cow ledger did not merely record taxes. It became a central pillar of Uri's evolving justice system. Disputes over ownership were brought before local arbitration councils, usually held in taverns or churchyards. The ledger served as a neutral witness, its entries cross-referenced, verified, and read aloud in public. In one case from 1417, a herder was accused of branding a neighbor's cow as his own. The case seemed unprovable until a faded 1413 ledger entry revealed a unique hoof deformity noted by the scribe: slight inward curl on rear left hoof. This note, buried in the footnotes, won the case. Over time, ledger footnotes were given formal standing as secondary evidence, and by 1450, scribes were trained not just in writing, but in observation, taught how to note scars, odd gaits, unusual coloring, and even behavioral quirks. They were bureaucrats, but also part biographers. Decline of the ledger era. By the late 15th century, however, change was on the horizon. With the rise of towns, coins, and complex legal codes, the cow-based ledger system began to strain under the weight of its own success. Cities like Lucerne and Zurich developed municipal registries that prioritized land, labor, and monetary tax over livestock. Even in Uri, younger generations saw ledger entries less as sacred civic duties and more as chores. There were attempts to modernize, including a brief experiment in 1498 with a debellentry cow accounting system, modeled on Venetian merchant books. It failed spectacularly, with farmers refusing to accept negative cow balances as anything but an insult. By 1520, ledger-based governance had been largely replaced by written law codes and notary courts. The cow ledger, once the soul of Uri's civic life, was relegated to archives used mostly for historical reference, property claims, and the occasional genealogical inquiry. The last entry, the final active entry in the original cow ledger system, was made in 1534. It simply read, 3 cows transferred from Martin of Ettinghausen to Sister Elspeth of the convent of Engelberg. 1 bell retained in memory of the mother cow, Goldhorn. The scribe signed it with a note, let memory be gentle and grazing peaceful. Reflections on bureaucratic power. In hindsight, the cow ledger of Uri appears both trivial and profound. On one hand, it was a painfully slow, analog, detail-obsessed system filled with minor notes about cattle behavior, ear notches, and seasonal milk quotas. On the other, it was a tool that created civic identity in a stateless land, standardized trade across regional boundaries, provided a stable model for credit and contracts, elevated scribes and literacy to positions of social power, allowed a loosely federated region to survive and thrive. Its story reminds us that history isn't only made by wars and kings, but by rituals of writing, systems of record, and the quiet perseverance of clerks who dared to count. And in that counting, with every hoof, bell, and curl of ink, something extraordinary happened. A nation began. But ask yourself this: what stories are we recording today that, centuries from now, will quietly define who we were, not through drama, but through the persistence of the mundane? Story 2. Counting cheese, Gruyer's medieval accounting system. Nestled in the rolling green folds of the Prealps, the small village of Gruyers in western Switzerland appears at first glance to be the kind of place where history might have dozed off. Stone cottages, church steeples, and a hilltop shade all sleep peacefully under centuries of fog. But look more closely beyond the postcard scenery, and you'll find something far less romantic, yet far more enduring. A record-keeping system for cheese that, at its peak, rivaled the precision of any royal court. This is the story of cheese as data, a tale not of battles or bloodlines, but of salted curds, alpine cellars, and the bureaucrats who built a community by measuring milk and weighing wheels. Let us begin in the year 1386, not with a dramatic war or a plague, but with a wooden stick carved with notches, a tally stick passed quietly between a farmer and a cheesemaster on the village square. The wheel as wealth. By the 14th century, Gruyere cheese, rich, dense, and aged in cool mountain cellars, had become a highly sought-after commodity. Unlike fresh goods, Gruyere could last through winter, travel long distances, and serve as a reliable medium of exchange. You could trade a single 35-kilogram wheel for salt, wool, or even construction labor. As demand grew, so did the need to record production, aging, ownership, and trade. Cheese, after all, did not mature overnight. A wheel started as a vat of curdled milk, but it might pass through 3 or more hands before reaching a market in Bern, Geneva, or beyond. And with every transfer came the need for a record. The Gruyere tally system. Before parchment, ink, or ledgers, there were tally sticks. In Gruyere, these were made of split beechwood carved lengthwise with matching notches along the 2 halves. One side was kept by the producer, usually a herder or small-holding farmer, and the other by the local affiner, the person responsible for aging and managing the cheese in communal cellars. Each notch represented a wheel deposited into aging storage. The notch's width indicated size. Its spacing sometimes reflected age or seasoning. When the cheese was eventually sold, the two halves would be reunited to verify the count, much like reconciling two sides of a ledger. A small collection of these sticks still survives, darkened with time, smooth at the touch, and bearing a quiet precision that is both agricultural and administrative. But tally sticks, for all their usefulness, had limits. As Gruyère's cheese economy expanded, so did the need for something more reproducible. The rise of the cheese clerk. In 1391, records from the Abbey of Hauterive mention the appointment of a Frauenschreiber, literally, a cheese scribe. His job? To compile monthly reports on cheese inventory, cellaring conditions, and sales made at the Gruyère's market fair, which by then attracted merchants from across the Swiss plateau and the Savoyard territories. These scribes were not cheesemakers. Most were literate sons of merchants or minor clergy, trained in Latin, arithmetic, and rudimentary contract law. They kept parchment books divided into 5 columns. Producer name, wheel size in local pounds, date of entry into cellar, projected maturation date, final disposition, sold, bartered, consumed locally. The earliest of these surviving ledgers are remarkable for their detail. 1397 entry reads, Pierre of La Partie delivered 2 wheels, 21 pounds each, moisture high, aging begun under the care of a finer clod, due for turning on St. Bartholomew's Day. Not only was cheese counted, it was monitored. The turnings. A critical moment in the aging of Gruyère came with the turnings, regular rotations of the wheels to prevent moisture pooling and to allow for even fermentation. Originally done by feel and smell, turnings became a scheduled civic event. Each wheel was assigned a turning day based on when it entered the cellar. Scribes marked these days in special margins called Kesserränder, cheese borders, often decorating them with small glyphs resembling wheels or milk droplets. Missing a turning could result in fines, as unevenly aged cheese fetched lower prices. The affiners kept records not just of who delivered the cheese, but who turned it, how often, and whether they were late. This system incentivized punctuality and contributed to Gruyère's rising reputation for consistency. Cheese as collateral. By the early 1400s, cheese had begun to function as a form of bankable wealth. Farmers who needed seed grain, tool repairs, or even marriage dowries would use cheese aging in the communal cellars as collateral. A notary document from 1413 notes, Jean of Charmy pledges 3 wheels, medium turn, to the baker of Bull in exchange for 2 sacks of winter wheat. Transfer of ownership conditional upon failure to repay within 6 moons. The cheese remained in the cellar, tagged with wax seals, and its maturation continued under the affiner's care, but its ownership changed on paper. Scribes adapted their ledgers again, now adding a 6th column, lienholder's name. Thus, the system absorbed debt, legal claims, and even inheritance. Gruyère cheese was no longer just food, it was structured dairy finance. Women in the margins. Though rarely credited, women played a quiet but vital role in Gruyère's cheese accounting system. Widows and unmarried daughters often inherited cheese debts or inventory when male relatives died, and they had to appear at tally reconciliations, sign cellar registers, and oversee household accounts. Marginal notes sometimes refer to la femme de, but by the mid-1400s, some names stand alone. 1449 ledger references. Marguerite of Malleson, guardian of 4 wheels, filed claim against unreturned milk token. While women were largely excluded from formal council meetings, their presence in the economic margins reveals a shadow economy of household cheese management that intersected constantly with official records. They were, in essence, unsung accountant stewards of dairy wealth. The salt record dispute. Gruyere cheese required salt, lots of it, for both flavor and preservation. This meant a steady reliance on salt imports, mostly from the Rhône Valley and the Franche-Comté. Salt prices were volatile, and salt was often taxed by weight or volume. To keep salt purchases transparent, the cheese clerks began a side ledger called the Salzbuchlein, Little Salt Book, which tracked salt acquired, price per sack, intended usage, rind wash, brine bath, cellar treatment. In 1458, an argument erupted when a shipment of salt spoiled in transit. The affiner, held responsible, claimed it had been delivered improperly wrapped. The salt vendor claimed the clerks had overreported the loss to hide embezzlement. A public tribunal was convened, using the salt book, the cheese-turning records, and several tally sticks as evidence. The case lasted 2 weeks and ended with both parties being fined, the vendor for poor packing, the affiner for misreporting spoilage weight. The ruling was etched into the cellar door lintel. Salt is not to be trusted when wet. Cheese beyond borders. Gruyère's bureaucratic reliability made it attractive not just locally, but regionally. Towns as far as Lausanne, Bern, and even Lyon began to request warranted wheels cheeses accompanied by a certified slip bearing the Gruyère seal, the scribe's name, and a summary of aging history. These slips were hand-copied and tied to the cheese with dyed wool cords. Wheels without a slip were considered risky and sold at reduced prices. In effect, Gruyère invented a form of early product certification, centuries before modern food regulation. Their cheese was trusted not only because of taste, but because of its paper trail. A cellar collapses. Then, in 1464, disaster struck. After heavy spring rains, the largest communal cheese cellar located beneath the old Abbey granary partially collapsed, damaging dozens of wheels and burying a portion of the cheese ledgers in silt and rubble. Clerks scrambled to reconstruct entries from memory, using surviving tally sticks, salt book entries, and even spoken testimony from farmers. Not all entries could be recovered. Some disputes lasted for years. The collapse triggered the first recorded audit of Gruyère's cheese economy, overseen by outside notaries from Fribourg. The result: a recommendation to double-copy all cheese entries and store backups in separate villages. It was the beginning of a distributed bureaucratic system, one designed to survive disaster. By the close of the 15th century, Gruyère had not only refined its cheese, but its method of remembering. Each wheel that rolled out of its cellars carried with it a lineage, a name, and a story not in legend but in ledgers. And yet beneath the tidy entries and official seals, one detail remains unclear. How did Gruyère decide when a cheese was truly ready? And who exactly got to make that call? By the mid-15th century, Gruyère's cheese economy had become one of the most intricately documented food production systems in medieval Europe. From tally sticks to salt ledgers, its records were exhaustive, its processes controlled, and its exports in high demand. But one problem remained, and it was a stubborn one. When was the cheese done? The question of ripeness, once left to a cheesemaster's tongue and nose, had become a matter of trade law, legal dispute, and sometimes public scandal. And so, Gruyère did what Gruyère had always done. It bureaucratized the question. Taste as an institution. In 1473, the village council of Gruyères formed the Comité de Goût, the Taste Committee. Its purpose: to establish fixed criteria for cheese maturity and to provide certification of ripeness for all export-bound wheels. The committee was made up of 2 affiners, aging cellar masters, 1 cheese clerk, 1 neutral taster, usually a priest or elder from a nearby parish, 1 rotating foreign merchant as an observer. The process was ritualistic and highly structured. A wheel was pulled from the cellar and washed. It was tapped with a wooden mallet and checked for soundness. A hollow echo meant dryness. A dull one meant excess moisture. A cheese trier, a narrow, cylindrical probe, was inserted into the wheel to extract a core. The sample was examined for color, texture, and aroma. Only then was it tasted. The committee scored each cheese on a 4-point scale. Cru, raw, too young, not for sale. Mûrissant, ripening, edible but imperfect. Mûr, mature, suitable for trade. Parfait, fully matured, premium market value. The score was recorded in the Livre des Saveurs, or Book of Flavors, a companion ledger that included not just scores but tasting notes. One entry from 1479 reads, Wheel of Marguerite of Tassachaux, rind faintly brined, center nut sweet, slight sharpness on tongue, Mûrissant. The Guild of the Tongue. In time, the committee's work expanded. By 1488, the tasters had organized themselves into a formal guild, the Compagnie de la Langue de Gruyère, the Company of the Tongue. Membership required. A public tasting examination. Proven impartiality, no active dairy holdings. A vow to avoid strong spices and drink that might dull the senses. The guild's seal, a stylized tongue flanked by 2 cheese triers, became a mark of trust. Export wheels bore wax stamps embossed with this seal, and buyers across the Alps came to rely on it as a guarantee of quality. But as with any system of certification, power dynamics crept in. The lawsuit over a bitter wheel. In 1492, a merchant from Lausanne brought a lawsuit against the Gruyère's Taste Committee. He claimed that 5 certified parfait wheels were, in fact, bitter and crumbly, unfit for trade. He accused the guild of favoritism. The wheels came from a prominent family. Negligence in tasting. Falsifying records in the Book of Flavors. The case, known as the Procès des Cinq Rois, was held publicly in the town square. Testimony included a visiting monk who said the cheese smelled of stone, a cellar assistant who confessed to flipping the wheels only once every 2 weeks instead of weekly, the merchant's own wife, who cried on the stand about ruined trade. Ultimately, the court ruled partially in favor of the merchant. 3 of the 5 wheels were deemed improperly aged, and the cheese guild was ordered to publicly revise the scores, refund part of the merchant's cost, tighten their tasting schedule. This led to the Rule of 8, mandating that every wheel be tasted at least once every 8 weeks during its aging process. The aging tags and the cheese library. To comply with new regulations, Gruyère's developed an early tracking system using tags made from thin birch bark. Each tag was tied with red twine to a wheel's rind and included the producer's mark, date of entry into the cellar, seller ID number, current taste rating, clerk initials. These tags were then indexed in a cheese library, which by 1503 contained over 1,200 tagged entries. Clerks began storing this information in wooden drawers sorted alphabetically by producer, and then chronologically. Each drawer had carved panels with small horn emblems to signify the cheese's origin, a cow horn for full milk cheeses, and a sheep's curl for mixed milk variants. This system allowed for the first aging projections. Clerks could forecast future exports and inventory levels with surprising accuracy. Some of their quarterly summaries survive, with neat rows of numbers and predictions such as March, 123 wheels to reach Mûr status. May, 67 wheels to be reassessed. 12 expected to decline from Mûrissant due to moisture spoilage risk. The matter of the wind. By the early 1500s, cellar conditions had become a major concern. Gruyère's aging rooms were naturally cooled, often located in partial caves or beneath thick stone buildings. But temperature fluctuations, especially caused by changing wind patterns, could throw off maturation timelines. One particularly volatile summer in 1509 led to dozens of cheeses cracking or developing unwanted molds. This triggered the first environmental regulation in Gruyères, the Wind Management Edict, which required cellar doors to be double shuttered, no more than one wheel per 2 square feet of floor space, rotating placement to avoid wind-prone corners. A special logbook, the Livre du Vent, was kept to monitor wind exposure and temperature variance. Affiners began marking cheese condition with small charcoal dots to track environmental effects. Some wheels even had wind scars, visible marks from uneven drying, which clerks would note and sometimes sketch in the ledger margins. These marks, ironically, became a mark of authenticity. Traders from Geneva once requested winded wheels as proof of origin. The question of patience. At the heart of all this documentation, however, remained a deeply human tension. How long should one wait for perfection? Cheese that aged too little could be bland. Cheese that aged too long could sour, split, or crumble. But aging tied up space, labor, and resources. Every extra week of storage meant cost. By 1510, the average wheel was aged for 94 days before certification. But merchants began pressing for faster turnarounds and affiners for longer ones. A conflict emerged between economics and taste. A series of village council meetings in 1511 debated the question. Arguments were heated. One older taster insisted that 120 days was the minimum for the soul of a wheel. A merchant from Bern countered that his customers couldn't taste the difference and didn't care. In the end, a compromise was reached. Each producer could declare their preferred aging range, so long as it was declared in the Book of Flavors. This preserved transparency and allowed the market to decide. But it also raised a deeper question. Was the bureaucratization of taste liberating, or did it trap Gruyère in an endless cycle of record-keeping for something meant to be savored, not scored? By the early 16th century, Gruyère's cheese bureaucracy had reached its height. With double-logged ledgers, cellar rotation charts, flavor scorebooks, salt inventories, and official tastings under the Guild of the Tongue, every wheel of cheese carried not only weight and flavor, it carried a story. But as with all systems that grow too precise, cracks eventually formed. This final section will explore how the cheese bureaucracy that once stabilized a village economy began to wobble under its own weight. Through shifting trade routes, changing tastes, and the slow unraveling of scribal control, we'll witness the bureaucratic architecture of Gruyère bend and transform. The pressure of the markets. In 1513, the first direct trade route between Bern and Lyon bypassed Gruyères entirely. Salt from the south and cheese from central Switzerland began moving faster, more efficiently, and without the heavy documentation Gruyères required. Merchants now had a choice: accept Gruyère's bureaucratic overhead with its tastings, delays, and certifications, or buy simpler wheels from Fribourg or Emmental. Many chose the latter. Gruyère's strict system, once its strength, began to feel like an obstacle. Clerks noticed a change. The number of external merchant requests fell. Wheels once tagged with full flavor scores sat longer in cellars. A scribe's note from 1515 reads, 8 wheels turned for the third time with no destination. Taster Leroy suggests reduced salting. Merchant interest waning. In response, the council loosened export requirements. Not all wheels had to pass through the Comité de Gout anymore. Wheels could be sold uncertified, provided they were not fraudulently labeled. But this led to the rise of a new issue: cheese forgery. The Great Cheese Fraud of 1517. In spring of 1517, a scandal broke out when 14 wheels marked as Parfait de Gruyères were discovered in Geneva, with no official flavor records. They had been branded with faked stamps made from carved bread crusts pressed into red wax. The cheese tasted fine, not bad, not great, but they were Gruyère. The cheesemaster who sold them, a man named Bastien de Broc, argued in court that the cheese had been aged in the Gruyere tradition and that he had honored the spirit of the label. The trial lasted 11 days. The court ultimately ruled that Bastien had misled buyers, and he was fined 5 wheels, a rare example of a dairy-based legal penalty. More importantly, the Guild of the Tongue was tasked with defending the brand, and began stamping wheels not just with seals, but with numbered identifiers tied to seller records. It was the dawn of cheese serial numbers. But these efforts couldn't stem the tide. Internal decay, too many rules. By 1522, Gruyere had 4 active ledgers per cellar, a tasting book updated monthly, a salt register cross-checked by 3 clerks, a cellar wind log, and a tax log that accounted for rind loss during aging. Each new problem, fraud, spoilage, merchant loss, had produced a new layer of regulation, but not necessarily a better result. Affiners complained that half their day was now spent documenting, not aging. Farmers balked at cellar fees, and the town's younger generation, newly literate but restless, began abandoning the clerical roles for more profitable city trades. The cheese bureaucracy was becoming a burden, not a benefit. The collapse of the Flavor Guild. In 1530, a wave of disease swept through the region, affecting both livestock and humans. Milk production fell. Cellars emptied. The Guild of the Tongue, once a powerful force in civic life, suspended operations due to illness and lack of funds. When it reopened, only 3 of the original 5 tasters returned. Meetings were irregular. Taste ratings became inconsistent. And a finer wrote, "They now taste with sick tongues and empty purses." A wheel declared parfait today would have been called mourissant last winter. The guild dissolved officially in 1534, replaced by a looser system of cellar certifications overseen by individual producers. By 1540, the Livre des Savoirs had stopped receiving entries. Adapting to change. Yet Gruyere did not disappear. Cheese production continued streamlined, less centralized but alive. Individual affiners developed their own reputations. Instead of communal books, many producers created personal cheese logs, small leather-bound notebooks tracking batches, salt levels, aging times, and buyer feedback. Some of these survive today, passed down as family heirlooms. Their ink faded but their lines precise. In a sense, the bureaucracy had decentralized. It no longer lived in the hands of scribes, but in the habits of artisans. The spirit of tracking, of caring about detail, had migrated from public ledgers to private practice. The modern aftertaste. In the centuries that followed, Gruyere cheese continued to evolve, shaped by geography, market forces, and global taste. But echoes of the old system still linger. The AOP certification, Appellation d'Origine Protégée, used today to protect Gruyère's authenticity, mirrors the Flavor Guild seal system. The cellar turning schedules used by affiners still draw on 15th century routines. Even the wheel size, about 35 kg, remains consistent with medieval ledgers. But perhaps the most remarkable legacy is this. Gruyère's cheese was never just a product. It was a process one recorded, tested, tasted, and trusted over generations. The records were sometimes tedious, sometimes excessive, but they taught a lesson still relevant in modern governance. That even something as seemingly simple as a wheel of cheese can require complex systems of trust, time, and verification to thrive. And as the final book of flavors was quietly shelved in a cellar corner in 1541, one scribe added this note in a cramped hand. The tongue fades, but the cheese endures. Story 3. The Charter of the Mist, the founding treaty no one could read. In the mountainous heart of early Switzerland, where mist settles between pine ridges and church bells echo down stone valleys, lies one of the more peculiar stories in the slow, quiet evolution of bureaucracy. The story of a foundational legal document that no one, not even its signatories, could fully read. This is the tale of the Charter of Brunnon, a supposed alliance treaty, trade agreement, or perhaps a mere oath of cooperation, drawn up between the cantons of Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden sometime in the late 13th or early 14th century. Its actual purpose is unclear. Its authorship is disputed. Its meaning, hotly debated then and now. What's known is this: a charter existed. It was written. It was signed. It was sealed. And it was never fully understood, not even by those who carried it from monastery to council chamber in thick woolen wraps, hoping it might someday settle disputes they couldn't otherwise resolve. This is the story of the bureaucratic equivalent of a sacred relic, believed in, venerated, referred to, and largely unreadable. The gathering at Brunnon. Sometime around 1291–1315, representatives from 3 cantons met in the small lakeside village of Brunnon, then little more than a ferry post between Lucerne and the southern passes. The reasons for the meeting were practical, not idealistic. Disputes over grazing rights, shared roads, tolls, and armed escorts for salt shipments had become too frequent. Each canton, Uri, Schwyz, Unterwalden, had its own dialect, customs, and scribes, and each kept its own local records, often in different languages or legal styles: Latin, medieval Alemannic German, and regional variations thereof. A decision was made. A joint charter would be drafted. It would unify basic trade rules, outline shared responsibilities, and, most importantly, serve as a neutral authority, something all 3 could refer to in future disagreements. But there was a problem. 1 scribe, 3 languages. The monk chosen to write the charter was Brother Nicolaus of Murbach, a literate but reclusive figure known for his neat script and limited diplomatic experience. Nicolaus primarily wrote in Latin, the language of monasteries and ecclesiastical records. To him, Latin was the language of permanence. So, with ink drawn from soot and wine, on sheet parchment still rough from hand stretching, Nicolaus composed a document in formal monastic Latin, filled with compound verbs, archaic phrasing, and legal references pulled from canon law rather than local custom. Representatives from the 3 cantons stood behind him as he worked, and according to later notes, none of them fully understood what he wrote. They nodded politely, they added wax seals, and they took home copies of the Charter of Brunnon, each believing it said something slightly different. The confusion begins. The earliest disputes began in 1317, when Uri claimed that the charter guaranteed right of passage through Schwyz without toll, while Schwyz insisted it allowed toll collection in winter months only. To resolve this, they unrolled the charter in the chapel at Seedorf. 3 local scribes attempted to read it. They failed. Notes from the meeting say, much Latin but of a priestly kind. Many clauses cross over. None agree on paragraph meaning. The tolls remain unclear. The meeting concluded with a compromise. Uri could pass freely in summer, Schwyz could charge in winter, and Unterwalden would mediate any disputes. And yet this very outcome was the opposite of what some believed the charter had stated. The document's power, strangely, increased after this. The charter's physical presence. Despite its incomprehensibility, the Charter of Brunnon became a symbol of neutrality. It was stored in a carved oak chest in a rotating fashion. 4 years in Uri. 4 years in Schwyz. 4 years in Unterwalden. Each time it was transferred, a small civic ceremony was held. The charter was carried by 2 notaries, wrapped in waxed linen, placed on a cart lined with straw. Town elders would touch it as it passed, sometimes praying, sometimes bowing. By 1332, the charter was being referred to in council minutes as the Mist Agreement, not because of its origin in foggy Brunnon, but because its meaning was as clear as mist. Even monks joked about it. One wrote in a marginal note, "The charter speaks but only in riddles, like a saint who mumbles in dreams." Attempts at interpretation. Several attempts were made to decode the document. In 1348, a scholar from Lucerne translated parts of it only to admit he could not guarantee accuracy due to corrupted clauses. In 1360, Unterwalden hired a notary from Basel, who declared it beautifully phrased but largely irrelevant. By 1372, Uri began referring to the spirit of the charter, rather than its wording an elegant solution for a document no one could understand. Still, the charter remained central to civic life. It was used to justify ceasefires between villages, resolve minor trade disputes, avoid appeals to outside powers like the Habsburgs. Even when contradictory, it was cited like scripture, malleable, mysterious, and always correct if interpreted the right way. A treaty of trust, not words. By the turn of the 15th century, scholars began referring to the charter not as a contract, but as a symbolic anchor. It had no direct power, no clear clauses, and no enforceable terms, but it represented the idea that cooperation was possible. And so it lived on. Copies were made, each slightly different. One had 3 seals, another had 4, one included a prayer in the margin, another a doodle of a cow. The original, faded by humidity and cracked at the folds, began to disintegrate, but no one dared rewrite it. To do so would be to claim certainty, and the charter had long since become a monument to ambiguity. It was bureaucracy by faith. The charter in modern light. Centuries later, the Charter of Brunnen was rediscovered in a dusty vault in Altdorf. Historians attempted a full translation. Their conclusion: the Latin was grammatically correct, but filled with undefined regional idioms. Some phrases contradicted others. No one could determine the exact meaning of the clause on common salt exchange and seasonal freedom. And yet, in many ways, the charter had worked. It prevented wars, it facilitated trade, it endured. Because the people who held it confused though they were believed it mattered. And in doing so, they built consensus not through clarity, but through cooperation in confusion. But consider this. What happens when a bureaucracy is built not on rules, but on the belief that the rules exist somewhere, even if no one can quite read them? By the mid-14th century, the Charter of Brunnen, the vague, Latin-rich, untranslatable document, had not faded from Swiss political life. On the contrary, its lack of clarity had become its greatest strength. Like a shrouded mirror, it reflected whatever interpretation was most convenient at the time, giving communities a way to negotiate instead of war, and to defer conflict by invoking shared bureaucracy. If the document's meaning had been clear, it might have been contested, debated, or torn apart by differing interests. Instead, it was respected, precisely because no one could say for sure what it meant. But belief in a thing, particularly a document, can only hold back politics for so long. The age of arguments. Between 1350 and 1400, over a dozen official disagreements between Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden ended in appeals to the Charter of Brunnen. Each time the document was ceremonially unrolled, and each time its words failed to provide answers. Among the more notable cases, in 1359, Schwyz accused Uri of underpaying for bridge repairs. Uri cited a clause about common roads and mutual burden. Schwyz responded that the phrase applied only to mountain roads, not bridges. In 1374, Unterwalden claimed that a clause promising reciprocal access to forests allowed it to collect firewood in Uri. Uri countered that forest in the document referred to planted groves, not wild woodland. In 1391, during a livestock trade conflict, Each side cited a different translation of the same line. One claimed it allowed for duty-free oxen. The other insisted it excluded animals entirely. In each case, no conclusion could be drawn from the charter itself. Yet it still played a key political role. It was seen as a starting point for negotiation, and rejecting it would have been seen as rejecting the Confederation itself. The rise of the interpreter scribe. To handle this chaos, the cantons began appointing charter readers, men trained in multiple dialects, skilled in ecclesiastical Latin, and often blessed with diplomatic patience. These were not merely translators. They were interpreters, tasked with finding consensus within ambiguity. They were often older monks, retired notaries, or respected village elders. Their duties included reading the charter aloud in Latin and then in local German dialect, offering plausible interpretations based on tone, word order, or known idioms, providing notes that might satisfy all parties, even if not definitively accurate. In one 1383 dispute over toll payments, a charter reader famously concluded, "The words are cloudy, but the intent seems generous." And that sufficed. These interpreters became custodians of civic calm, and their presence often diffused heated meetings. But they were also human instruments of power. Their interpretations subtly favored one side or another, depending on alliances, debts, or reputations. A marginal note from Schweiz's records in 1399 reads, "Brother Albrecht's reading today pleased Unterwalden too much. We shall seek another next time." Copies and corruptions. As the original charter began to physically deteriorate, copies multiplied. Each canton made its own version, some by hand, others by hearing monks from Lucerne, Zurich, or Einsiedeln. But as copying increased, so did errors. Some copies left out entire lines. Others corrected the Latin based on regional preferences. A few included marginal glosses that eventually became mistaken for part of the original. By 1420, there were at least 7 known versions of the Charter of Brunnen, all considered valid by different parties. In one amusing episode, Uri and Schwyz argued over whose version to cite in a forest boundary conflict. Unterwalden proposed a compromise: use both and interpret whichever one was more peaceful in spirit. The final ruling, curiously, was based not on the text, but on the age of the parchment, with the older version considered closer to truth. Bureaucracy for memory, not precision. What's striking about this era is how bureaucracy, especially this opaque, misunderstood document, was not used to create legal certainty, but rather to record shared memory. Rather than delivering judgments, the charter preserved relationships. By invoking it, cantons acknowledged their mutual history. By reading it together, they reaffirmed participation in the Confederation. Even when useless for decision-making, it remained emotionally and symbolically powerful. This made it function more like oral tradition in written form, not to clarify, but to anchor. The charter's use in national mythology. As Swiss identity began to coalesce in the 15th century, the Charter of Brunnen took on a new role. Chroniclers from Lucerne and Bern began to cite it in founding myths, often incorrectly, as proof of early democratic unity. One chronicler, writing in 1452, even claimed, "The charter speaks thus: all men of the mountains are free in peace and united in bread." No such line exists in any version of the document. But it didn't matter. The charter had become a repository of aspiration, its opacity allowing each generation to project their values onto it. Like an ancient constitution written in fog, it absorbed meaning by not being too specific. A mirror, not a map. By 1480, debates over the charter's literal meaning had mostly ended. Instead, it was invoked in ceremonial language. As the charter says, according to the spirit of Brunnen. in respect to the missed agreement. Its text was less consulted than its presence displayed at market fairs, hung in council halls, paraded on feast days. In that way, it came to resemble religious relics, not proof, but testament. It was a reminder that bureaucracy does not always depend on clarity. Sometimes, it depends on ritual and shared belief. But the question remained, could a system survive on belief in a document, even when that belief outpaced the document's meaning? By the time the 16th century cast its longer political shadow across the Swiss Confederation, the Charter of Brunn had long since ceased to be read aloud for meaning. It was now something else entirely, an icon, a ritual, a foundational object whose vagueness gave it strength and whose endurance gave it authority. The charter, that misstrapped scroll penned in ornate Latin by a solitary monk, had transcended its textual limitations. It no longer served as law, but as legacy. And perhaps, in the end, that made it more powerful than any clearly worded document ever could be. The final readings. The last recorded public reading of the charter occurred in 1515, on the eve of the Battle of Marignano. It was not read to determine any legal clause. It was read to unite. 3 cantonal elders from Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden stood before a crowd in a candle-lit chapel. The charter, already yellowed and cracked at its creases, was read line by a notary who had rehearsed the Latin but openly admitted he did not understand all of it. Each phrase was followed by a pause, not for commentary, but for reflection. The crowd remained silent. At the end, the document was folded again, blessed, and placed beneath the altar. What the people heard was not law. What they experienced was memory. The document retires. By 1530, the Charter of Brunn had been sealed in an archival chest in Altdorf, accompanied by a vellum note in German. Let this scroll remain as witness to our beginning, not our end. We consult it no more, for we have moved beyond its mist. By then, newer compacts and treatises, especially the Federal Pact of 1315, and later the Tagsitzung Protocols, had taken its place in actual governance. They were clearer, more enforceable, more modern. And yet none of them commanded the emotional reverence of the Charter. That reverence was tied not to what it said, but to what people believed it once meant or could have meant. It was a monument to ambiguity, and in that ambiguity it had bound 3 separate valleys into a single, improbable union. Bureaucratic mythmaking. As literacy expanded in the 16th and 17th centuries, the Charter of Brunn was reinvented by historians, schoolteachers, and national chroniclers. Few bothered to read it. Fewer still could translate it accurately. Yet its story, that of a foggy lakeside agreement forming the bedrock of Swiss freedom, became a mythic truth. Artists painted scenes of its signing wildly anachronistic, full of feathers, candles, and dramatic gestures. Children learned songs referencing the words of Brunn, and theologians cited the Charter as proof that moral law need not be perfectly understood to be powerful. In time, the Charter was no longer a text, but a concept. A mirror in the museum. Today, a copy of the Charter, or what is believed to be the earliest extant version, rests in the Swiss National Museum in Zurich. It sits behind glass, beside the more famous Federal Charter of 1291, quietly collecting stares. Few visitors read the translation plaque. Fewer still grasp its implications. And yet, the Charter lingers in Swiss administrative culture. The Swiss Confederation, in many ways, still functions on the delicate balance of regional autonomy, mutual obligation, voluntary cooperation. All principles believed to be somehow encoded in that original, unreadable document. What we learned from the Charter. There is something gently radical about the Charter of Brunn. Not because of what it said, we still don't fully know that, but because of how it was used. It unified people who did not agree, by allowing them to pretend they did. It deferred conflict by creating space for interpretation, rather than insisting on rigid truth. It built bureaucratic cohesion, not by clarity, but by consensus in confusion. It's tempting to mock a document that no one could read, but perhaps the real insight is this. In a world obsessed with definition, we forget that not all systems need perfect comprehension to function. Sometimes, belief in the structure is enough to hold it together. The fog that stays. We often imagine bureaucracy as a machine, something cold, precise, and logical. But in truth, many bureaucratic systems operate not by sharp lines, but by ritual, memory, and shared uncertainty. The Charter of Brunnon was never clear, and yet it was trusted. That trust carried weight. It calmed fears. It mediated conflict. It laid a foundation. Not by instruction, but by intention. And so, centuries after it was written, perhaps even wrongly written, it still invites the question. If we build a system on shared belief rather than clear rules, does it make the belief stronger or the system more fragile? Story 4. A very long argument about firewood, the Bernese forest dispute. In the shadows of Switzerland's Gothic rooftops and ivy-draped council chambers, the city of Bern, wealthy, influential, and immaculately ordered, was once nearly brought to administrative paralysis not by war or famine, but by firewood. This is not a story of timber trade or major deforestation. It's a tale of gathering sticks, deadfall, twigs, and brush for household heating and cooking. And it's a tale that unfolded slowly, through petitions, votes, countersigned permits, and endless council meetings, all in pursuit of what seemed like a simple question. Who gets to gather the wood that no one planted, but everyone needed? This is the Bernese forest dispute, a quiet crisis that began in the late 15th century, stretched for over 60 years, and involved dozens of villages, 1,000 recorded complaints, over 400 council sessions, and precisely 0 violent incidents. It is one of the longest-running, most exhaustively documented bureaucratic disagreements in pre-modern Swiss history, and by the end of it, nothing had burned except patience. The forests beyond the walls. Bern, by 1480, was a city on the rise. With a growing merchant class, expanding guilds, and strategic control of alpine passes, it had become a power center in the old Swiss Confederacy. But its residents still relied on basic fuel, primarily wood, gathered from surrounding forests. The forests in question, especially those west of Kernes and south of Schwarzenberg, were technically public land, but had long been treated as customary commons by nearby villages. These included the hamlets of Riedbach, Niederschurli, and Zimmerwald, where farmers had for generations wandered into the woods to collect branches, bark, and the occasional small, fallen trunk. Then came the Bernese Council Regulation of 1483. Regulation number 17, on the usage of lower forest growth. In a well-intentioned effort to preserve forest land and prevent erosion, which had begun damaging trails and farmlands, the Bernese Council enacted Regulation number 17, which declared, "No wood, branch, or root shall be gathered from public forest lands without writ of consent, to be issued by the city forest clerk's office." It seemed clear enough, but implementation proved anything but. The petition avalanche begins. Within weeks, the council clerk's office received more than 200 handwritten petitions, mostly from rural widows, millers, and poor herders. Some were desperate, others were livid. A few were penned in Latin, most in vernacular dialects, and at least one scrawled on the back of a bread wrapper. They asked, how much constitutes a branch? What's the difference between deadfall and low-hanging? Was gathering bark from stumps included? Could children gather twigs without adult supervision? The city clerk, overwhelmed, began issuing temporary permits. These were valid for 1 week, up to 8 bundles. no larger than a man's thigh. This immediately created confusion over enforcement and led to accusations of favoritism. By March 1484, Byrne had appointed a forest access inspector. His title was grand. His job was to walk around and ask villagers why their bundles looked a little too large. "It's only for soup," the defense of the people. Villagers often defended themselves with what came to be known as the Sepensbruch, the soup plea. They claimed the wood was only for boiling soup, gathered for a sick mother, picked from the ground, not cut, blessed by the local priest. One document from 1485 reads, "Elizabeth of Obereid confesses to gathering 3 armfuls of fallen pine. She claims the wood smelled holy and was needed to warm her husband's broth." These statements were catalogued, copied, and stored in a growing ledger known as the Waldkligbüch, the Forest Complaint Book. It soon needed a second volume. The rise of the forest dossiers. To manage the dispute, the city created individual wood-gathering dossiers for over 700 residents of outlying villages. Each file included name, number of dependents, annual fuel needs, proximity to forestland, past wood-gathering behavior. This data was used to calculate permitted usage weights, which were then printed onto wood tokens distributed by the forest clerk's office. Each token bore a carved symbol, sun, tree, or flame, the year, the bearer's initials, the maximum bundle weight in Bernese pounds. But villagers frequently lost the tokens, broke them, or forgot them entirely. In response, the council issued stringable tokens, small tokens with holes so they could be tied to a belt. One clerk wrote, "The peasants now carry strings of firewood licenses like charms. They rattle like cattle bells in the chapel." The circular meetings. Between 1490 and 1510, the Bernese Council met 137 times to address variations of the same questions. Could wood be gathered during Lent? Could one person carry another's quota? Could bark be used for tanning as well as fire? Were bundles taxed by weight or volume? Meeting minutes grew repetitive. Council scribes began using shorthand like Q17 again. Petition Ray Bark writes. Soup plea invoked, denied. They eventually compiled an internal document titled Recurring Arguments Regarding Dead Wood. It was 312 pages long. The Compromise of St. Martin's Day. In 1502, a temporary compromise was reached. On St. Martin's Day, villagers were allowed to gather unlimited deadfall from specified forest tracts without permits. The result, an avalanche of wagons and bundles. Some called it the Great Scraping. Villagers scoured the forest floors so thoroughly that even moss was stripped from tree roots. Small animals fled. One poet of the time wrote, "Even the squirrels wept." Afterward, the council quietly scaled back the holiday. A bureaucracy without fire. Strangely, for all the paperwork, all the permits, all the committees, no violence ever broke out. No trees were felled in protest. No forest inspector was harmed. Instead, bureaucracy served as a slow-motion arena for negotiation. People complained, officials responded, policies shifted slightly. A few people quietly ignored the rules, most did their best. And the forests, they remained mostly intact. But even as rules multiplied, one question lingered in the margins of the ledgers, written in the frustrated scrawl of a scribe around 1509. Why are we still discussing the same bundle of wood 26 years later? By the early 16th century, what had begun as a regulatory effort to preserve forest land had turned into one of the most quietly exhaustive administrative processes in Bern's history. The forest dispute, now nearly 30 years old, was no longer merely a conflict over branches and bundles. It had evolved into a bureaucratic ritual, one that occupied clerks, councils, villagers, inspectors, and woodcutters alike in a dance of permits, appeals, and contradictory rulings. And while not a single battle had been fought, the toll was measured in ink, patience, and policy fatigue. The standard bundle debate, one of the most intractable arguments of the entire affair, centered around a deceptively simple question. What is the legal size of a firewood bundle? The forest clerk's office had originally set the standard as no larger than a man's thigh and no longer than a mule's back. This naturally led to disputes over whose thigh? Which mule? What if the mule was unusually short? In 1504, the city commissioned the Fabric Guild to create a standardized measurement cloth, a coarse-woven strip known as the bundle mass, embroidered at each end with a small pine branch symbol. Villagers could wrap the cloth around their bundles to confirm they were compliant. But the cloth shrank when wet, and villagers soon discovered that stretching it in the sun added 2 finger lengths. The council received complaints. One bundle gatherer argued successfully, "My bundle fits when the cloth is warm, and I do not burn frozen bundles." The emergence of wood currency. By 1508, the wood permit tokens now made from stamped brass instead of carved wood had begun to circulate as currency. Villagers traded them for favors, ale, or even cheese. A full bundle permit was worth half a day's wage in some villages. This unintentional wood-backed economy worried city officials, who issued a decree. Forest tokens are not coin, and their trade shall be discouraged. Yet trade continued. Small markets formed on the outskirts of Bern where tokens could be exchanged, often at discount. Children collected expired tokens to play games involving bundle weights and mule-length guesses. The bureaucratic tool had become a social object. The classification system. To bring order to the chaos, the forest clerk's office introduced a new classification system for firewood. All wood gathered was to be tagged by type and intended use. The categories included Kochhal's cooking wood, Heijerlsli small heating sticks, Trockensweg dry twigs, Kernscheit heartwood pieces, Abfallrind waste bark. Gatherers were issued wax-sealed paper slips denoting their category and allowed collection zone, but enforcement proved difficult. Inspectors often couldn't distinguish between cooking and heating wood, especially in damp conditions. Villagers adapted by claiming all wood was for soup, once again invoking the soup plea, which now held quasi-legal weight. The role of village woodmasters. By 1510, the council had delegated local enforcement to village-appointed woodmasters, Halsmeister, effectively creating a decentralized forest governance model. These woodmasters were typically chosen from respected elders or retired foresters. Their duties included supervising permitted gathering times, checking token validity, mediating disputes between gatherers, reporting violations to the central council. Some woodmasters were zealous, others lenient. One, named Jakob of Riedbach, became known for allowing his neighbors to gather on non-permitted days, claiming that even the birds do not wait for permits to pick twigs. Jakob was eventually summoned before the Bernese council, but defended himself successfully by presenting 2 bundles wrapped in bundle mass cloth, each measured precisely. He was allowed to continue. The council's endless revisions. Between 1500 and 1515, the council revised its firewood regulations 12 times. Some notable changes included requiring bundles to be tied with hemp, not flax, which burned too quickly, instituting forest quiet days during Lent, prohibiting gathering during hours of fog to prevent concealment of size, allowing compassion permits for households with infants or the elderly. Each revision generated new petitions. One scribe remarked, "Each rule spawns 3 appeals, and each appeal another interpretation." By 1512, the Forest Regulation Codex had grown to over 400 pages, including tables, diagrams, and marginal notes from multiple generations of clerks. The city began storing it in its own cabinet in the archives hall, with an iron latch labeled, "For when firewood is the law, the people endure." Despite all of this, villagers did not revolt. They adapted, they petitioned, they learned the system. Some even came to respect it not for its clarity but for its regularity. One widow from Zimmerwald, aged 78, had filed 42 separate requests for firewood permits between 1486 and 1514. All were approved. Her final one included a note: "Thank you for the wood. My kitchen still breathes warmth." And yet the question persisted. Why did the dispute never resolve? Why, after decades, could no one agree on the definition of a simple stick? Perhaps, as one counselor speculated in 1515, the wood is less the matter than the manner. They want to be seen, counted, permitted, and known. By 1520, the forest dispute, once an attempt to bring order to burns surrounding woods, had become something of a local institution. It was less a conflict and more a habit, deeply woven into civic life. Permits were printed seasonally. Bundle measurements were enforced with mild size. The Forest Regulation Codex, now bound in iron clasps, was still consulted weekly. And yet, the original issue, the overgathering of wood, had faded. Not because of a final ruling, but because there was no longer enough wood left to argue about. The forest had been used up, the bureaucracy remained. The gradual disappearance of fuel. Years of careful collection, deadfall bundling, and under-the-table branch gathering had thinned the forests around Bern. Not dramatically, there was no clear cutting, but incrementally, year by year. Inspectors reported in 1519, "Less to gather, twigs are fewer. Some villagers carry brooms of bark just to show compliance." Even the once vibrant village markets that traded bundle permits and brass tokens began to slow. One record noted, 4 villagers waited 3 hours to purchase a single Trockensweg token. No wood available to claim. The forest near Kernes was declared temporarily closed for recovery, which most interpreted as already bare. But strangely, the regulatory system persisted. The shift to monitoring compliance without wood. As gathering slowed, officials shifted focus from what was gathered to how well the system was followed. Were permits filed on time? Was the bundle mass cloth still being used? Were woodmasters rotating as scheduled? The bureaucracy became self-sustaining. It began measuring compliance, not resources. In this period, clerks created faithful gatherer certificates, paper proofs issued to villagers who hadn't gathered any wood at all, but had still filed proper paperwork. They became minor honors in small communities. One woman from Ostermundigen had 6 such certificates. They were found decades later, folded carefully inside her family's Bible. The official end that was. In 1524, a vote was held in the Bernese Council. Should the Forest Regulation Codex be retired? The vote narrowly failed 12-11. Opponents argued that the system had become tradition, and tradition is itself a forest of rules. Besides, removing it might lead to confusion or worse, expectations of change. So the council decided instead to issue perpetual deferral of enforcement, meaning the regulations still technically applied, but would not be actively pursued. In effect, the rules remained, but the forests did not. Decline without conclusion. Over the next 2 decades, brass wood tokens stopped being minted. The cloth bundle measures were stored in a museum case. Forest inspectors were reassigned to canal inspections. The Waldkligbuch Book of Forest Complaints was repurposed as scrap for parchment bookmarks. By 1550, no one referred disputes to the Forest Codex, but no one formally repealed it either. In 1571, a new clerk found the codex in the archives and annotated the cover with, "Of some former importance, possibly theological," what the dispute left behind. Though the argument ended in silence, its effects endured in quieter forms. Villages developed non-written customs about firewood gathering based on the old permit zones. Burns' bureaucracy grew more attuned to slow conflicts disputes that required not resolution, but ritual. The idea that governance could be built on routine administration, rather than decisive law, became a lasting civic value. The Bernese forest dispute taught generations not how to manage resources, but how to manage disagreement slowly, document by document, without escalation. Final reflections in the margins. The last handwritten note about the dispute appears in the margin of a 1562 tax record. It reads, "No wood taken, permit filed, rules followed, all is quiet." It wasn't a victory, but it was peace. And in its own way, the Bernese forest dispute proved that a conflict doesn't need to end with a solution sometimes. It ends because there's nothing left to regulate. But the systems we build to manage disagreement may outlive the thing that caused it. What does it say about a society when its rules survive even after their reason disappears? Story 5. The Monks Who Copied Everything, Einsiedell's Forgotten Archives. Deep in a forested valley of central Switzerland, the Abbey of Einsiedell rests beneath the mists and pines like a stone scroll, quiet, contemplative, and filled with secrets. Today, it is a pilgrimage site, known for its Black Madonna statue and Baroque architecture. But centuries ago, long before its gilded altars and painted ceilings, Einsiedell was known for something humbler. Copying, not writing, not illuminating, not even necessarily understanding. Just copying. This is the story of a monastery that became a living backup drive for the Holy Roman Empire. The story of how quiet monks, armed with quills, wax tablets, and extraordinary patience, preserved thousands of documents, many of which no longer exist anywhere else. This is the story of how boredom became survival. A monastery made of margins. Founded in 934 CE, the Einsiedell Abbey was originally little more than a chapel and a few wooden structures built near the hermit cell of Saint Meinrad, a monk who had lived alone in the forest and been murdered by bandits. In the following decades, under the guidance of Benedictine discipline, the abbey grew in influence. But it was never wealthy in the way that abbeys in France or Italy were. It had modest lands, few relics, and limited income. So it invested in something it could afford: scribes. Dozens of monks, trained in silence and stillness, were put to work copying texts, not just theological works but also legal contracts, trade agreements, genealogies, council minutes, travel permits, property disputes, and even complaint letters. In short, bureaucratic debris, the things most people throw away. Einsiedell kept it all. The scriptorium as an assembly line. By the 11th century, Einsiedell had a dedicated scriptorium, a cold, stone-floored chamber with small windows and long wooden desks. It wasn't grand. It was utilitarian. The process went like this. Original documents sent from Zurich, Lucerne, or further afield were handed to a senior monk who checked their condition. The text was dictated aloud in a slow, rhythmic voice. Multiple scribes wrote simultaneously, each using parchment and iron gall ink. Margins were left intentionally wide for notes and clarifications. Finished copies were reviewed, corrected, and bundled into folios for storage. These were not artistic copies. They weren't illuminated. They weren't decorated. They were designed to last, not impress. And they did. What they copied and why. Unlike many monasteries that focused only on religious texts, Einsiedeln took on administrative overflow from surrounding towns and bishoprics. This included annual land tax assessments from farmers in Glarus, toll logs from merchants crossing the Gotthard Pass, records of cheese and wine shipments into the canton of Zug, notes from court cases in village taverns, ecclesiastical permissions for marriages and inheritances. These documents were sometimes sent by official request, but more often they were copied unsolicited simply because the monks had the time, materials, and drive to preserve. They believed deeply that preserving knowledge, even trivial knowledge, was a form of prayer. The creation of the archive by default. Over time, Einsiedeln became known as the place that remembers. Nobles and merchants began sending documents there just in case. One Lucerne merchant wrote in 1297, "Send a copy to Einsiedeln. If the city burns, the monks will still have my deeds." By the mid-14th century, Einsiedeln had amassed over 1,200 contracts, hundreds of tax ledgers, marriage permissions, guild records, decrees from minor princes, letters from obscure abbots. None of this was organized in the modern sense. There were no catalogs, no consistent classification, but the documents were grouped by type and wrapped in cloth, stored in labeled trunks. One trunk might be marked Land Disputes East of the Reuss, 1270-1303. And inside, dozens of parchment sheets, sometimes crumbling, sometimes annotated, often unsigned. The preservation of errors. Interestingly, Einsiedeln's scribes did not correct mistakes. They copied exactly even when the original was flawed. A famous case involved a wool trade agreement from Zug that had a miswritten year, Anno 1293 instead of 1393. The monks copied it exactly, nodding only in the margin. Written thus, possibly an error. Modern historians are grateful. Einsiedeln preserved how people wrote, not just what they wrote. Misspellings, smudges, unfinished clauses, all were included. As a result, these archives offer rare insights into vernacular spellings, regional Latin abbreviations, dialect influences, scribal shorthand, and even medieval sarcasm. One court record from 1322 includes a marginal comment from a monk. "This man lies like an Italian." It was not redacted. Forgotten yet surviving. In the 16th century, as printing presses rose and monastic copying faded, Einsiedeln's role as a copyhouse ended. The scriptorium was converted to a storage chamber. The old trunks were moved to a stone room with a single iron door. They were not forgotten, but they were no longer considered important. And so, they survived through wars, fire, plague, and modernization untouched and intact. Hundreds of documents that no longer existed anywhere else were preserved because monks who had nothing better to do copied them. They didn't always know what they were writing, but they knew it mattered, or might. But ask yourself this. In an age when so much is recorded but so little is preserved, what is lost when we stop copying what seems unimportant? By the late 14th century, Einsiedeln Abbey's reputation as the quiet custodian of Central Europe's unremarkable paperwork was growing. Slowly, quietly, without fanfare, monks had filled room after room with copies of documents other institutions had long since thrown away or lost to fire, theft, or decay. But behind the modest walls of their scriptorium, a quiet revolution was underway, a revolution of preservation. While most of Europe was defining power through land, armies, or relics, Einsiedeln built influence by simply remembering better than anyone else. And then the copying became controversial. The scribes of no opinion. The monks at Einsiedeln did not consider themselves historians, judges, or even editors. They copied exactly, even when the material contradicted itself. even when it was outdated or duplicated elsewhere. This extreme neutrality was viewed with confusion and sometimes frustration by the secular authorities who sent documents for safekeeping. One letter from a Lucerne magistrate, dated 1376, complains, "Your scribes preserve our tax rolls with errors intact. We request they fix the misspellings at least." The monks replied simply, "To copy is not to correct. We do not polish truth." This position became doctrinal. The abbot at the time, Father Anselm, issued an internal rule: let ink not invent. The mistake that became policy. In 1391, a copying error nearly cost a family their inheritance. A will recorded from a noble in Unterwalden was copied with one key line miswritten. It originally said, "My second son shall inherit the mill." The Einsideln copy read, "My second son shall not inherit the mill." When the dispute reached arbitration, both sides presented their version. The monk who copied the document testified he had simply followed the dictation. The court ruled in favor of the family, but the mistake triggered a wave of scrutiny toward Einsideln's process. Were these monks truly neutral archivists or careless copiers? The abbey's response: they began attaching marginal notes explaining each stage of the transcription process. This line dictated on 14 October, in low light. Original document folded, line unclear. Voice of speaker unclear, Latin ambiguous. Rechecked against second copy, error repeated. These comments, initially defensive, evolved into a kind of meta-history, a record of how the records were made. The scriptorium as a memory engine. By the early 1400s, the scriptorium ran 6 days a week, sunrise to dusk. Shifts were long. Silence was enforced. The only sounds, the scratching of quills, the occasional clearing of throats, and the soft tap of sand sprinkled to dry ink. Each monk averaged 4 or 5 pages per day. Parchment was carefully measured, margins regulated. Every line was reviewed twice. If a mistake was made, it was not crossed out. A note was added. Erratum, line retained for record. The monks began developing house styles, minor variations in letter forms, punctuation, and even flourishes on capital letters. Over time, historians would come to identify specific scribes by the tilt of their G or the shape of their R. In modern terms, Einsideln had created version control for medieval knowledge. Documenting the mundane. What makes Einsideln's archive so extraordinary is what it chose to preserve. Where other monastic libraries filled their shelves with commentaries on scripture or ancient Roman authors, Einsideln recorded grazing rights in snow season, canceled salt contracts, lists of spoiled cheese, tax disputes over water rights, rules for street sweeping in Lucerne, even a record of a chicken that caused a tavern fight. 11423 document reads, "Hen of red feathers entered Bern Tavern, claimed by no one, caused fright among drinkers, damage to 2 mugs." It's not a legend, it's just something that happened. And Einsideln copied it. When other archives burned, what truly elevated Einsideln's archive was time. Fires, floods, war, and the slow indifference of bureaucracy led to the loss of original records across Switzerland and southern Germany. But Einsideln, tucked away in the mountains, mostly untouched, still had the copies. In 1467, a merchant from Zurich filed a claim for land once owned by his grandfather. The city's registry had burned in 1439. The only record was Einsideln's copy written in 1402, with 3 marginal notes and 2 signatures. The abbey produced it within a day. From that point forward, Einsideln was recognized not merely as a monastery, but as a court of last resort for memory. The strange power of the archivist. This quiet power did not go unnoticed. By the late 15th century, Einstein was invited to council meetings not to offer opinions, but to produce copies. The phrase, "check what Einstein says," became common in legal disputes. The monks never made rulings, but their role was critical. If a fact was disputed and Einstein had recorded it, that version stood. They were not lawmakers. They were keepers of what once was said. And in that role, they influenced policy without ever raising a voice. Bureaucracy by choice, not necessity. What's perhaps most curious is that Einstein was never ordered to copy so much. They chose to, for centuries. When asked why, an abbot simply replied, "Because the world forgets." And so the monks kept copying. Even now, their archives contain tens of thousands of sheets, some still unstudied, some nearly illegible, all preserved without ambition, without credit, and without interruption. They copied not for power, not for fame, but because memory mattered. But consider this. What happens when memory is preserved by those who never shaped it but whose quiet hands come to define the past for everyone else? By the beginning of the 16th century, the world around Einsiedeln Abbey was shifting. Cities like Zurich and Basel were growing into centers of commerce. The first Swiss printing presses were humming in cloistered back rooms. Scholars debated the boundaries of canon law and humanism. The Reformation loomed on the horizon. But inside Einsiedeln's stone walls, in the cool silence of the archive, the monks continued to copy. They copied more slowly now. The incoming requests had slowed, the need had shifted, but they still copied. And in their persistence, they revealed something quietly radical. That to preserve, even without understanding, is to serve the future. The scribes age out. By 1510, many of the original scribes who had built Einsiedeln's collection were elderly. Their scripts, once straight and crisp, now leaned and trembled. One marginal note reads, "This line copied with tired hand, vision poor, may God forgive the slope." There were fewer new monks joining the order. The appeal of monastic life had begun to wane. Cities offered books, music, even universities. The idea of spending one's life copying water tax records and cheese quotas no longer drew the young as it once had. But the older monks stayed. Some copied texts they themselves had already copied decades earlier, recopying the copies for preservation. In their minds, the act wasn't duplication, it was continuity. The copies of the copies. It was around this time that Einsiedeln initiated a strange practice, transcribing their own archive. Fearing decay, the monks began selecting older, faded parchments and recopying them into new volumes still by hand, still on parchment, still exactly as they had done before. They copied the spelling mistakes. They copied the marginal notes. They even copied the fold lines, drawing them in ink. One scribe in 1512 replicated a spill from the original parchment by sketching an ink blot into the new copy, labeling it. Stain from wine, copied faithfully. Modern archivists call these echo volumes. To an outsider, they look like original records, but they are copies of records that were already copies, a recursive archive, maintaining the illusion of continuity even as the originals vanished. It's hard to say how many of Einsiedeln's original documents are in fact fourth or fifth generation transcripts. But to the monks, it didn't matter. The role of the non-reader. Remarkably, many of Einsiedeln's later scribes didn't understand what they were copying. Documents were often in Latin, German, or French dialects foreign to the younger scribes. Yet they copied word for word, stroke for stroke, including strange abbreviations and phrases they did not know. To them, the act of copying was not interpretation, it was devotion. They were not writers. They were vessels, a term used in a 1521 rule revision. Let the brother be as a vessel, filled with meaning, even if unaware of its taste. This profound humility meant that Einsteidl's archives preserved voices across centuries without filtering, censoring, or summarizing. They did not seek clarity, they sought continuity, the inventory that outlived its contents. In 1544, the abbey conducted an inventory of the archive. It included 3,430 7-bound folios, 1,129 scrolls, 297 wooden boxes of loose sheets, 188 unclassified bundles, and 33 documents described simply as unclear in purpose, but still copied. Among these were a receipt for 200 onions paid in advance for a wedding that never occurred, a contract signed by a blind man, marked with a thumbprint and an apology, a list of names of cows owned in a village that no longer exists, a dispute over who owned a fence no longer standing. Each of these was preserved with care, not for legal value, not for religious merit, but because someone once thought it mattered. And Einsteidl agreed. What survives? Today, scholars visiting the Einsteidl archive can touch these stories. The ink faded but intact, the folds still crisp, the voices silent but present. Many documents exist only here, nowhere else. Town records, family histories, small agreements, long-forgotten laws. In several cases, entire lineages have been reconstructed solely through Einsteidl's preserved land deeds and estate transfers. Their copy of a lost 1295 flood report in the Sihel Valley is now the only record of that event. A faded letter from 1411, describing a fire in a cheese cellar, is the earliest mention of cellar architecture in Switzerland. The monks who copied them never knew these documents would one day be priceless. They just knew someone should remember. The bureaucracy of legacy. Einsteidl's scribes were not bureaucrats in the modern sense, but they revealed something essential about bureaucratic resilience. That sometimes the power of a system is not in what it decides, but in what it refuses to let be forgotten. They proved that value can emerge from persistence, not prediction. And so, in a world of castles and crusades, plagues and revolutions, Einsteidl quietly documented everything, especially the parts no one else thought to keep. But ask yourself this: in an age of instant deletion and endless data, who are the ones still copying just in case we forget? Story 6. The Bridge Toll Receipts of Lucerne, 1307–1350. Lucerne in the early 14th century was a town in transition. Wedged between lake and mountain, it served as a natural corridor for traders, pilgrims, and livestock herders passing between northern Europe and the rising cantonal alliances of central Switzerland. At its center stood the Roos Bridge, a wooden span connecting the divided banks of a growing town. At first glance, it was just another medieval crossing, but at its base sat a small wooden booth, no larger than a hut, with a pointed roof and a reinforced hatch. Inside, a man with a book, a candle, and an iron lockbox. This was not a tax collector. This was not a merchant. This was a toll scribe, a clerk tasked with writing down, every single day, who crossed the bridge, what they carried and what they paid. And for more than 40 years, these receipts were recorded meticulously, repetitively, boringly, until they accidentally became one of the most detailed records of ordinary life in medieval Switzerland. The toll table that never changed. Established formally in 1307, the Lucerne Bridge toll was a simple system. Foot travelers, 1 heller. Livestock, 2 hellers per animal. Oxen teams, 4 hellers. Carts or wagons, 6 hellers. Merchants, 3 hellers, unless carrying wine, in which case 5. Local residents crossing for prayer, free if approved in advance. The fee structure rarely changed, but the receipts had to be written every single time. Notations like these were common. Martinus of Circe, with 1 ox and 3 sheep east to west paid 8 hellers. 2 women with spinning baskets denied charge residents west to east Sunday. Wagon with iron rings and 3 barrels, driver unknown, fee paid in coin, no dispute. Each entry followed a standard format. Name or identifier if known. Direction of crossing. Items or animals transported. Fee charged. Any dispute or unusual comment. It was, in every sense, a functional boredom. The ledgers of the bridge house. The toll booth's ledgers were not intended for posterity. They were used for 3 purposes: calculating daily collections, summed weekly; resolving disputes when people claimed they had already paid; monitoring trade flow into Lucerne by order of the city council. What no one anticipated was that these ledgers would survive. Stored in a dry storage room under the chapel bridge, the documents were largely forgotten until the late 1800s, when city archivists began cataloging Lucerne's medieval papers. They found nearly 90 volumes, each one filled with small, cramped writing, not prayers, not laws. Receipts. From these we now know the names of over 2,000 individuals who crossed regularly between 1307 and 1350. The types of goods traded. Seasonal livestock movement. Weather conditions. Scribes often noted if the road was muddy. And even patterns of pilgrimage, war preparation, and plague avoidance. A mirror of the mundane. The receipts don't offer narrative. They don't tell stories in the traditional sense, but if you read enough of them, patterns emerge. In early spring, a rush of ox carts from the southeast bringing dried meat. Midsummer, groups of pilgrims on foot heading to Einsiedeln or Fleury. Late autumn, a surge of wagons carrying apples, salted fish, or hay. Winter, sparse traffic with notations like 2 travelers only, bitter wind. One scribe from 1313 wrote, "None today, river froze, candle wax solid." Another from 1326, "Man in red cloak crossed 3 times, paid once only, argued, guard resolved." In isolation, these are meaningless, but together they create a rhythm, a heartbeat of a medieval town preserved in ink. Tensions over toll exemptions. As Lucerne grew in importance, tensions developed between locals and outsiders over toll charges. Monks and clergy often claimed exemption. So did visiting nobles. The scribes were instructed to follow policy strictly, but disputes became common. A typical entry from 1329 reads, "Abbot of Baramünster demanded free crossing with 4 mules, denied, paid reluctantly, left cursing." Others were more cooperative. Merchant woman from Zurich paid triple toll to avoid inspection, no questions asked. There were even notes on bribes, though always phrased delicately. No coin shown, small package received instead, left without issue. These cryptic observations reveal how bureaucracy interacts with power, and how even the most diligent record keeper must sometimes bend the system. Life in numbers. The toll receipts also unintentionally documented demographic change. From 1307 to 1349, the number of individuals crossing weekly increased by over 400%. This wasn't just from trade, it reflected population growth, urbanization, and rising pilgrimage. The ledgers record, week by week, the arrival of new families, the movement of journeymen, the transit of armed guards before regional skirmishes, and the quiet arrival of traveling physicians and herb sellers just before outbreaks of illness. By tracking these entries, modern historians trace the early signs of the Black Death's movement into central Switzerland in the 1340s. The first vague hint comes in 1347. 3 carts with shrouds, said to be from Basel, fee waived. A year later, none crossed, fear of plague, toll house closed for 6 days. The receipts, meant to count coins, had become silent witnesses to the reshaping of society. But here's something to ponder. What does it mean when our clearest view of the past comes not from the grand speeches or heroic deeds, but from a man writing down how many cows crossed a bridge on Tuesday? The toll booth at the Roos Bridge was never designed to record catastrophe. It was a place of coin counting and routine. But when crisis came, it did not discriminate between grand and small, noble and poor, alive and soon to die. Everyone still crossed the bridge, and the scribes still wrote it down. By 1347, whispers of plague from Italy and France began drifting up the Alpine passes. Lucerne remained calm, at least on paper. Trade continued. Pilgrims passed. Animals still clopped across the timbers of the bridge. But the receipts began to change. Fewer names, shorter entries, more notations about unknown travelers and carts with no declared goods. The system was recording something new, something it couldn't quite understand: the unraveling of normal life. From routine to record of ruin. At first, the receipts looked nearly identical to those from previous years, but a close reading reveals a shift. Early 1347. 4 traders from Altdorf, cart with wool and vinegar, paid in full, rain. 3 women with herbs and dried apples, paid 3 hellers, no complaint. Mid 1347. Cart with cloth bundles, men would not speak, fee waived. Physician from Zurich said to be fleeing illness, did not cross. 2 boys crossed alone, cried when questioned, let through. Then in late 1347, the first direct mention appears. Bodies wrapped in linen, claimed by nuns from Fleury, toll not collected. It was not an announcement. It was just another line in the ledger, but it marked a turning point. By early 1348, the toll records became shorter, bleaker. Closed for 2 days, guard ill. No crossings recorded, town silent. 2 carts with unknown cargo, no names, no coins. The system was failing in silence, but it was still writing things down. The dead crossed too. As the plague entered full swing in 1348, the bridge saw a new kind of traffic: the dead. Lucerne had no large cemeteries yet, and many families from the countryside brought bodies into town to be buried on consecrated ground. The toll scribes, ever diligent, recorded these too. Cart with 5 shrouds, claimed as children from Horwa. 2 coffins, paid 2 hellers total, no resistance. Man pulled sled with wife, could not speak, gate open without charge. There were even entries for mass burials. 22 bodies brought by monks, no names recorded, toll house not manned. At this point, the entries begin to fade not in tone but in quantity. The scribes themselves were falling ill. One account reads, 3 scribes absent, 1 dead, new boy trained but cannot write well. The script becomes shakier, the ink fainter. One heartbreaking line in 1349. None crossed, I am alone, God help us. The toll house shuts its book. In mid-1349, the toll records pause altogether. A blank stretch, no entries, no notes. It lasts for 6 weeks. Historians believe the booth was abandoned, either due to death, fear, or simple collapse of routine. When entries resume, they are sparse and disjointed. Returned 2 guards, rode quiet, burned booth to remove plague smell. The new entries reflect a changed world. Travelers crossing without goods. Fewer carts, fewer names. Merchants missing. The appearance of new toll evasion methods, or simply ignored policies. There are no formal declarations of policy, just the sputtering continuation of record keeping. It's as if the scribes, even in chaos, still felt compelled to keep counting, not because anyone ordered them to, but because they always had. Bureaucracy rebuilds itself. By late 1350, the receipts return to a semblance of normalcy. Slowly, new names appear. miller's apprentice crossing with flour, cart of soap from Basel, 3 pigs unusually lean. The tolls are collected again, guards rotate, a new candle holder is installed in the booth. But the town is smaller, the notes quieter, entire merchant families are no longer listed, the scribes remark on it. Old names missing, travelers fewer, more strangers. The receipts begin to take on a second function, not just tracking payment, but tracking survival. Who is still here? Who remembers how things were done? Which rules should we still follow? What the receipts remembered. When historians studied the Reuss bridge ledgers in the 20th century, they discovered something extraordinary. The only record of dozens of small tradesmen. Patterns in the spread of disease across trade routes. Early evidence of economic contraction, reduced tolls, fewer goods. The appearance of new occupations, plague cart drivers, herb women, grave assistants. And yet, despite all the tragedy, the receipts never changed tone. They were dry, neutral, procedural. 3 carts, 1 child, 2 pigs, fee paid. That line could belong to 1310 or 1349. It is the stability of form in the face of chaos that gives these records their strange, powerful resonance. They did not grieve. They did not panic. They wrote things down. But consider this. When the world changes suddenly, is the survival of process itself a form of resilience? When the plague subsided around 1350, Lucerne emerged scarred but intact. The Reuss bridge still stood. The booth still sat at its southern end, and the toll system, worn, weathered, and weary, resumed its work. But something fundamental had changed. In the decades that followed, Lucerne's toll receipts would become not only a record of trade and travel, but a quiet foundation for civic rebuilding. They helped the town remember, reorganize, and slowly reassemble a new version of daily life. This is the strange resilience of bureaucracy, not in its efficiency or vision, but in its insistence on continuity, even when the world no longer resembles what it was created for. Rebuilding by ledger. In 1351, the Lucerne Council ordered a review of the toll system. They didn't aim to revise the structure, it had worked fine before the plague. Instead, they wanted to know who was still crossing the bridge, what goods were still circulating, which merchants had returned and which had vanished. And so the toll scribes resumed with renewed precision. Entries from 1351. 2 carts from Zug, cloth, onions, salt, driver unnamed but badge from prior visit. Pilgrim with goat, said to be from Jura, paid with coin last minted before pestilence. Merchant Jernhard of Stands returns, confirmed same oxen as before. What emerges is not just economic recovery, but a form of civic memory. The toll receipts provided proof, however mundane, that people were still there, still moving, still acting. Bureaucracy as proof of life. After the plague, record-keeping became a form of presence. To be listed in the toll book meant you existed. To have crossed the bridge meant you were part of recovery. To pay your toll was to re-enter society. Some entries are heartbreakingly simple. Woman with sack of wheat, said nothing, paid 1 heller, bowed. Others show quiet relief. Merchant Johann returns after 2 years. No cart, just himself, toll waived by council order. For many who had lost family, homes, or trade partners, these receipts became a strange kind of validation. Even if they had no home, they had been recorded. This was not surveillance, it was survival through registration. When the records became memory. By 1360, the toll ledgers were so detailed, so rich with data, that they were used for more than just tolls. Courts consulted them in disputes over lost property or missing heirs. Monks used them to trace the paths of wandering pilgrims. Merchants used them to verify reputations or debts. The council used them to re-establish citizenship claims after records had been lost in the chaos of the plague. What began as simple counting had become a repository of continuity, a way to piece together not just economics, but human movement, memory, and meaning. One council note from 1364 reads, "Let it be known that the toll ledgers shall be preserved not only for coin and trade, but to know who we are." Bureaucracy as a civic ritual. By the late 14th century, the act of writing down bridge tolls became almost ceremonial. A rotation of scribes, now better trained and formally appointed, maintained the booth. A civic bell marked the opening of the toll window. Travelers often bowed not to the clerk, but to the process itself. The bridge receipts became predictable in an unpredictable world, impartial in an age of power and privilege, accessible even to the lowliest traveler, whose name would still be recorded. Though we think of bureaucracy today as cold or impersonal, for many in Lucerne it became a rare source of fairness, a system that treated a widow with a single goat the same as a baron with 4 wagons. Modern lessons from old paper. Today, the toll ledgers from Lucerne are preserved in climate-controlled archives. Scholars have digitized portions. Some entries have been mapped to reconstruct 14th-century trade routes or to trace the reemergence of local economies after the plague. But beyond the academic uses, they offer something more profound. They remind us that boring records, when kept with care, can outlive crises. Not because they predict anything, not because they tell grand stories, but because they endure. Even now, the handwriting of a tired clerk from 1348 can tell us what time people crossed the bridge, what they carried, what they paid, and that they were still alive. Final reflection. Bureaucracy is often mocked for its slowness, its rigidity, its devotion to procedure over people. But the Lucerne Bridge toll book suggests something else. That in a world collapsing from disease, it was the man with the ink pot, writing names in a cold booth, who helped the town remember how to live again. Not through laws or sermons, not through heroism, but through counting.